The neighborhood was buzzing with an unusual energy that Saturday morning. Normally the streets were quiet, lined with perfectly trimmed lawns and the occasional dog walker passing by. But today there was a flurry of activity, laughter, and the unmistakable smell of fresh flowers. Across the street, a large white house had its driveway packed with cars, some of them from out of town. Delivery vans were pulling up with boxes of decorations, floral arrangements, and trays of food. Music played softly from speakers outside, blending with the voices of friends and family preparing for something special. At the center of it all was a couple who had lived in the neighborhood for several years. They were well known, respected, and loved by most of the community. The groom, in particular, had become a familiar face beyond his home. He had been elected mayor a few years ago, known for being approachable, fair, and committed to the neighborhood. But today he wasn't thinking about politics. Today was about love, celebration, and family. He moved through the crowd, checking that everything was running smoothly. His bride-to-be stood nearby, adjusting the last of the floral arrangements with the help of her mother. She wore a simple, elegant dress, and her eyes sparkled with excitement. The couple shared quiet smiles whenever they caught each other's glance, exchanging a warmth that could be felt even across the bustling yard. Not far away, on the other side of the street, someone else was watching. The neighbor in the house across from the celebration had noticed the activity hours ago. At first it seemed harmless, a little noise, a few cars. But as the morning went on, her unease grew. She had always been cautious, perhaps too cautious about things that didn't fit her expectations. Something about the crowd, the size of the event, and the unfamiliar faces made her nervous. She found herself pacing inside her home, peeking through the curtains, and mentally noting every detail she could see. Boxes of supplies, a large tent being set up, dozens of guests arriving in cars. Each detail fed her growing suspicion. She muttered to herself about safety concerns and rules that might have been broken. Her mind started to imagine worst-case scenarios. She thought she might need to alert someone. Maybe the authorities should know what was happening here. She had always believed in doing the right thing, even if it meant stepping into uncomfortable territory. The bride's younger cousins ran across the yard, laughing as they chased each other between tables set for the outdoor reception. Elderly neighbors stopped by to drop off gifts, chatting warmly with the couple and congratulating them. The atmosphere was light, joyful, and full of love. To anyone watching without preconceived notions, it was a normal, beautiful wedding in a tight-knit community. But from behind the drawn blinds of the other house, it looked like something much different. As the morning continued, the groom moved from the driveway to the backyard, coordinating with the caterers and checking on the timing of the music. The sound of laughter and conversation filled the air. Friends hugged and joked, carrying trays of appetizers back and forth. Children played near the fountain, their squeals echoing across the yard. There were so many people that it seemed almost like a small festival. Yet the neighbor's mind worked differently. Each arrival, each sound, each movement was catalogued as a potential threat. By mid-morning, the neighbor had reached a decision. She couldn't ignore what she thought she saw. She dialed the number for the FBI, her hands trembling slightly, not entirely with fear but with a sense of duty. She spoke quickly, trying to sound calm, professional, and convincing. She explained that there was a large gathering happening in her neighborhood, something she found unusual and potentially concerning. She described the guests, the decorations, and the activity she had observed. Her voice carried an urgency that she hoped would impress upon the agent on the other end the seriousness of the situation. Meanwhile, at the wedding, no one seemed aware that the first stirrings of a potential misunderstanding were forming across the street. The couple continued with their preparations, sharing small, quiet moments together. The groom adjusted a ribbon on the tent. The bride checked the seating arrangements one last time. Their families were helping wherever they could, laughing together and taking pictures in the sunlight. A sense of excitement and anticipation was everywhere. The neighbor, now having made the call, felt a mixture of satisfaction and anxiety. She had done what she believed was necessary, but even as she put down the phone, a part of her wondered if she might have overreacted. She shook the thought away, telling herself she had simply taken precautions. After all, she had no way of knowing what was truly happening behind those walls. Her imagination had filled in the gaps, and she believed she had acted responsibly. Back at the wedding, more guests arrived. Some carried gifts wrapped in shiny paper, Others brought flowers or small homemade treats. The air was filled with the scent of fresh roses and the sweet aroma of pastries. Music from a nearby speaker played softly, a mix of classical tunes and popular songs that the couple loved. The children chased each other in the yard, giggling and tumbling on the grass. Everything about the scene radiated warmth, community, and celebration. The groom stepped aside for a moment to speak with the wedding planner. They went over the timing of the ceremony, making sure the guests would be seated on time. He smiled as he listened to her suggestions, nodding in agreement. The bride watched from a distance, her eyes sparkling with happiness, her hands clasped in excitement. In that moment, everything seemed perfect, and for a few seconds the stress of the day melted away. Yet across the street, the neighbor continued to watch. She had moved closer to the window, trying to get a better view without being seen. Each new detail, the number of people, the food, the flowers, seemed to confirm her worst fears. Her thoughts spiraled as she imagined scenarios that were wildly exaggerated, but, in her mind, possible. She pictured all sorts of events, from disruptions to crimes that might be happening. The reality of the joyful gathering was completely lost to her imagination. By late morning, the tension in her home had grown. She checked the clocks on the walls, convinced that the situation might escalate at any moment. Her call to the authorities had been made, but now she waited, pacing from room to room, listening for sounds that she believed might signal trouble. Every laugh, every shout, every cheer from the other house made her nervous. She could not see the faces clearly, could not hear the words being spoken, but she was certain something was happening that needed intervention. Inside the wedding, preparations moved forward without pause. Guests were settling into their roles, some helping with last-minute touches, others taking photos or chatting in small groups. A group of family members carried chairs and tables to the backyard, arranging them neatly for the reception. The groom's parents arrived, offering hugs and words of encouragement. The energy was joyful, collaborative, and full of love. The bride walked through the yard, adjusting decorations, talking to her cousins, and occasionally stopping to laugh with a friend who had just arrived. She did not notice the neighbor across the street, peering from behind the curtains with suspicion. She only saw the happiness around her and felt a growing excitement for the day ahead. Each moment was precious, filled with emotion, anticipation, and the promise of celebration. The neighbor, however, had moved beyond simple observation. She had convinced herself that action was necessary. Her call had been made, and she waited for confirmation or guidance. She imagined law enforcement arriving at any moment, swooping in to handle whatever she believed was a dangerous situation. She imagined herself explaining everything, feeling validated, knowing she had done the right thing. But the reality of what was truly happening, the wedding, the love, the community coming together, was something she refused to acknowledge. As the clock inched closer to noon, the wedding was nearly ready to start. Guests were putting on their final touches. The caterers were arranging food on the tables, and the musicians were tuning their instruments. Everything was in place. Everything was beautiful. Everything was peaceful. And yet, a block away, one person remained caught in a web of suspicion, unable to see the scene for what it truly was. The morning sun shone brightly over the neighborhood, casting long shadows from the trees and making the flowers glow. It was a day meant for celebration, for love, for joy. The couple, surrounded by family and friends, stood ready to take one of the most important steps of their lives. They were unaware that across the street, someone's imagination had created a story far from the truth. A story that would soon lead to tension, confusion, and ultimately, an unforgettable lesson. And so the day moved forward, the sounds of celebration growing louder, the laughter spreading through the yard. Cars continued to arrive. Guests greeted one another, and the couple moved among them, exchanging hugs and smiles. Life was unfolding exactly as it should, a day of joy and unity. Little did anyone know the neighbor's phone call had already set things in motion, a series of events that would bring authorities to the scene and lead to one of the most surprising, awkward, and unforgettable moments in the neighborhood's history. The morning continued, full of promise and energy. The couple took a quiet moment to themselves, holding hands, sharing a look that said more than words ever could. Around them, the community buzzed with excitement, unaware of the storm of misunderstanding brewing just across the street. It was a day that began with love, laughter, and preparation. A day that would soon remind everyone how quickly fear and assumption can overshadow joy. But for now, the wedding went on. Every laugh, every step, every smile reinforced the beauty of the day. And across the street, a neighbor watched, her mind racing with concern, her heart filled with a mixture of fear, pride, and the certainty that she had done what she believed was right. After the phone call, the neighbor felt a strange mix of satisfaction and anxiety. She sat down at her kitchen table, hands gripping the edge tightly as she waited for a response from the authorities. Her mind replayed everything she had seen that morning, each detail exaggerated in her imagination. She pictured large groups of strangers, loud noises, and mysterious deliveries as if they were part of something dangerous. Each imagined scenario seemed more convincing than the last. She told herself she had acted responsibly, that she had prevented a potential disaster. Across the street, life at the wedding continued in full swing, oblivious to the concern brewing nearby. The groom moved from one area to another, greeting friends who had come early, making sure the tables were arranged properly, and checking in with the caterers. The bride adjusted a few flowers that had shifted in the breeze and laughed with a cousin who was struggling to hang a string of lights. Children ran in circles, squealing with delight, their energy filling the yard with life. Every movement, every sound reinforced the happiness that had brought everyone together. As the neighbor's anxiety grew, she paced back and forth in her home, glancing at the street through the curtains every few minutes. Each new arrival at the wedding seemed to confirm her suspicions. She saw more cars pull up, more people get out, and more laughter spilling across the yard. In her mind, this was no longer a simple celebration. She imagined crowds, chaos, and disorder. She imagined the authorities arriving any second to handle a situation she believed was serious. Inside the wedding, the groom's parents arrived, carrying gifts and offering words of encouragement. They moved gracefully among the guests, hugging old friends, smiling warmly, and sharing quiet jokes with family members. The bride's relatives had begun to set up chairs for the ceremony, lining them neatly in rows. The music was carefully chosen and flowing through the yard, a mix of light melodies and upbeat songs that brought energy to the gathering. The sun shone warmly, casting a golden light over the scene. Meanwhile, the neighbor had made herself a cup of coffee but could not sit still. Her eyes were constantly drawn to the activity across the street. She whispered to herself, pointing occasionally toward the house as if speaking to an invisible partner. Each sound, each movement, each cheer seemed amplified in her imagination. She believed she had done the right thing, yet she could not shake the feeling that she was about to witness something serious. The phone rang and her heart jumped. She grabbed it quickly, almost dropping the cup in her hands. On the other end was an agent from the FBI. The voice was calm, professional, and polite, asking her to explain the situation in detail. The neighbor's words tumbled out quickly. Half sentences and anxious explanations mingled together. She described the crowd, the music, the children running, the vehicles, and the decorations. She emphasized her concern, insisting that something might be happening that was unusual or suspicious. The agent listened carefully, taking notes, asking questions in a calm, measured tone. He asked about the number of people, whether there were any weapons, any loud arguments, or anything that seemed dangerous. The neighbor hesitated, then spoke about the size of the event, the unfamiliar faces, and the general energy of the gathering. She made it clear that she had no proof of any crime, but felt strongly that authorities should investigate. Meanwhile, back at the wedding, friends were helping with small details. Someone carried trays of hors d'oeuvres from the driveway to the reception area. Another guest helped organize seating arrangements for the ceremony. The groom walked among them, checking every detail, ensuring everyone felt welcome and comfortable. The bride laughed as a cousin accidentally dropped a bouquet of flowers, quickly picking them up and placing them in a vase. The atmosphere was light-hearted, calm, and filled with warmth. The neighbor hung up the phone and felt a mix of relief and anticipation. She knew she had done what she could, and now she waited for someone to arrive. Every sound from the wedding house seemed louder, more intense. The laughter, the music, the chatter, all of it felt like evidence to her that something serious was happening. Her imagination raced with potential scenarios, each one more dramatic than the last. At the same time, a few police cars were dispatched to the neighborhood, responding to the call. 2 officers arrived first, driving slowly and carefully toward the wedding house. They parked a short distance away, observing the scene. One officer glanced at the other and shook his head slightly, a quiet expression that suggested he was already forming his own opinion. The house looked perfectly normal from where they stood. The yard was orderly, the guests well-behaved, and everything seemed peaceful. The officers stepped out of their vehicle, their presence noticeable but not alarming. They walked toward the front of the wedding house, exchanging polite greetings with a few early arrivals who were standing near the driveway. The groom noticed them and approached with a calm, welcoming demeanor. He extended his hand, smiling, and introduced himself. The officers returned the greeting, noting his calm and confident tone. One of them leaned slightly toward the other and whispered something inaudible, a quiet acknowledgement of recognition. The bride continued arranging flowers, unaware of the officers approaching. Her attention was fully on making the day perfect. Friends and family moved around her, helping in small ways. Someone brought a large tray of drinks and another guest offered a basket of snacks for the children. The atmosphere was filled with care, love, and attention to detail. Each person played a role in ensuring that the day unfolded smoothly. Meanwhile, the neighbor peered from her window, growing increasingly nervous. She had heard the distant hum of sirens, but convinced herself that the authorities were moving slowly to assess the situation. She imagined a confrontation, a tense moment that would prove she had been right all along. Her heart raced with anticipation. Every step the officers took toward the house seemed magnified in her mind. She whispered instructions to herself as if she could guide them to handle it properly. The officers approached the front yard, speaking briefly with the groom. One of them recognized him immediately, the mayor of the town, someone they had seen in meetings and community events. Recognition passed between the officers silently, a moment of realization that changed the entire perspective of the call. They were now fully aware that this was no ordinary wedding, but a gathering led by someone they knew and respected. The tension of the moment shifted subtly, from potential danger to polite oversight. At the same time, the neighbor had noticed the officer's arrival and pressed closer to the window, holding her breath. Her imagination ran wild. She pictured chaos, confrontation, or a serious investigation unfolding. Every polite gesture from the officers seemed to her a prelude to something significant. She had convinced herself she was about to witness a serious event, and her mind raced to anticipate what would happen next. Inside the wedding, the groom spoke with the officers calmly. He explained the situation briefly, introducing a few guests and clarifying the purpose of the gathering. He maintained a warm and welcoming tone, confident that there was no problem. The officers listened attentively, nodding and occasionally asking questions. Their approach was professional, and they seemed reassured by the calmness and organization of the event. The bride finally noticed the officers and paused, curious about the new visitors. She moved closer to her groom, glancing at the men politely. He introduced her briefly and she offered a quiet smile. The guests nearby noticed the officers as well, some nodding politely, others continuing their conversations without concern. The overall mood of the wedding remained joyful, though a subtle awareness of the situation began to spread. The neighbor, still watching, felt her excitement mixed with confusion. She had expected tension, perhaps even chaos. Instead, she saw calm conversation, polite gestures, and smiles. Her mind struggled to reconcile what she imagined with what was actually happening. Each detail she observed contradicted the dramatic scenario she had built in her head. The officers continued to move through the property, serving quietly and respectfully. They asked a few routine questions about the event, confirming details about the number of guests, the timing of the ceremony, and general safety measures. The groom answered patiently, confident in his explanation. His calm demeanor reassured both the officers and the guests, creating an atmosphere of professionalism and warmth. Meanwhile, the neighbor had begun to feel a creeping sense of doubt. She had anticipated a dramatic, possibly dangerous situation. Instead, she saw a perfectly organized wedding, with friends and family enjoying a day of celebration. Her excitement began to waver, replaced by a mix of embarrassment and unease. She had called for help based on suspicion alone without knowing the full story, and now she was starting to see the consequences of her actions. Back at the wedding, the music played, children ran through the yard, and friends continued helping with preparations. The bride and groom shared quiet smiles, aware of the authorities but focused on their day. They moved among the guests, exchanging greetings, laughing, and ensuring that everyone felt welcome. Their confidence and warmth were a quiet statement of how love and community could overcome fear and misunderstanding. The neighbor watched from her window, frozen. Her phone call had set events in motion, but what she saw now was nothing like she had imagined. The authorities were calm, the wedding was orderly, and the couple seemed entirely at ease. Her mind struggled to make sense of the contrast. She realized that her fears, her assumptions, and her imagination had created a story far removed from reality. By the time the morning had reached its peak, the wedding was fully underway. Guests chatted, ate, and laughed, unaware of the tension across the street. The groom moved gracefully among them, greeting everyone, checking on details, and sharing moments of quiet joy with his bride. The officers had finished their initial inspection and were about to leave, their presence acknowledged politely by the hosts. The neighbor remained by the window, caught between relief and embarrassment. She had believed she was acting responsibly, yet she now saw that her assumptions had led to an unnecessary escalation. She felt a mixture of shame, confusion, and introspection, realizing that fear and suspicion can sometimes distort reality more than any actual threat ever could. The day continued, bright and full of promise. The wedding, filled with love, laughter, and family, moved forward undisturbed. The neighbor slowly stepped away from the window, her heart still racing but her mind beginning to understand the lesson she had just witnessed. The morning had moved into early afternoon, and the wedding in the yard was now in full swing. Guests had settled into small groups, chatting and laughing while waiting for the ceremony to begin. Children ran across the lawn, chasing each other in circles, their voices rising and falling like music. Tables were filled with colorful food, carefully arranged and garnished with flowers that caught the sunlight. The couple moved among their friends and family, checking details and sharing quiet smiles that carried all the excitement of the day. From across the street, the neighbor watched anxiously. She had been at the window for what felt like hours, her imagination running wild. Her earlier sense of satisfaction from making the call to the authorities had given way to unease. She wasn't sure what to expect next. Would the police arrive in force? Would there be questions, confrontation, or worse? Her mind filled with scenarios, each more dramatic than the last. Then she saw them. A pair of uniformed officers walking carefully down the street. Their cars were parked at a respectful distance, and they moved slowly, scanning the scene as they approached the house. The neighbor pressed closer to the window, gripping the edge of the sill with tense fingers. She whispered to herself, imagining the conversation that would happen, imagining the moment she would feel vindicated for calling. Her heart pounded and she felt a strange mix of fear and anticipation. At the wedding, the groom noticed the officers approaching. He remained calm, as he always did, his posture relaxed and welcoming. He greeted them with a polite smile and extended his hand. "Hello, officers, welcome. Can I help you?" he asked. His voice carried confidence and warmth, a quiet authority that immediately put people at ease. The officers returned the greeting, shaking his hand and introducing themselves. One of them recognized him immediately. His face lit up with recognition. "Mayor," he said quietly to his partner, a small smile on his face. "It's you." The other officer nodded, a brief look of surprise passing between them. They had expected something unusual, possibly even dangerous, but here stood someone they respected and knew well. The groom, noticing the officer's expressions, smiled politely. "Is there a problem?" he asked, genuinely curious. He gestured toward the yard where friends and family continued their preparations. The officers glanced around, taking in the scene. Tables neatly arranged, children playing, music softly in the background. Everything appeared orderly, joyful, and calm. The neighbor across the street pressed closer to the window, her breath catching as she saw the officers approach the groom. She had expected confrontation, tension, maybe even anger, but instead the scene was peaceful. The officers spoke quietly with the groom, asking routine questions about the event, the number of guests, and the timing of the ceremony. The groom answered patiently, explaining everything with a calm, friendly demeanor. Inside the yard, the bride noticed the new visitors and paused for a moment. She moved closer to her groom, curious about the officers. Her eyes widened slightly, but she trusted her husband to handle the situation. The groom introduced her briefly, and she offered a polite smile. Guests nearby watched quietly, sensing that the officers were part of an unexpected moment but not alarmed. The overall mood remained celebratory. The neighbor across the street couldn't believe what she was seeing. Her imagination had prepared her for chaos, for a serious confrontation, for something dramatic to happen. Instead, there was calm, polite conversation and smiles. Her heart raced, her thoughts collided. She had been so sure she was right, and now she felt a creeping sense of embarrassment. Her assumptions, fueled by fear and suspicion, were meeting reality in a way she had not anticipated. The officers continued their brief inspection of the property, moving carefully and respectfully. They asked questions about parking, the schedule for the ceremony, and the general layout of the event. The groom answered each question patiently, even inviting them to walk around the yard and see the preparations for themselves. Their expressions softened as they realized there was no threat, no disruption, nothing unusual beyond a large gathering of friends and family. Meanwhile, the neighbor's mind raced. She imagined the officers turning back to her at any moment, giving her praise for being observant, but the truth was far from that. She began to feel the weight of her own actions. She had let fear and suspicion guide her, and now she could see that her assumptions had been wrong. The officers had recognized the groom, a respected member of the community, and had handled the situation with calm professionalism. She felt herself shrinking back, suddenly very aware of her own misjudgment. At the wedding, the groom's calm and warmth continued to set the tone. He introduced a few of his friends to the officers, pointing out the children playing, the tables being set, and the musicians tuning their instruments. Everything was perfectly normal, yet so full of life and joy. One officer whispered something quietly to his partner, and they shared a small smile. Recognition and understanding had replaced tension and suspicion. The bride moved through the yard, checking on minor details and sharing laughs with friends and family. She noticed a few guests looking curiously at the officers but chose to continue her work, confident that the groom could handle the situation. Her calm presence helped maintain the atmosphere of the day, ensuring that nothing was disrupted by the unexpected visitors. The neighbor across the street watched, frozen. She had imagined confrontation, stern questions, or perhaps even a serious warning from the authorities. Instead, she saw smiles, polite conversation, and laughter. Her own heartbeat seemed loud in her ears as she realized just how wrong she had been. The fear that had driven her to make the call now felt foolish, a lesson she was only beginning to understand. The officers finally completed their walk through the yard, nodding politely to the guests and speaking briefly with the groom. They asked a few final questions, reassured themselves that everything was fine, and prepared to leave. The groom thanked them for their professionalism, shaking their hands again with a smile. The couple's calm and welcoming nature had turned what could have been a tense moment into a brief and memorable encounter of civility and respect. Inside the yard, the wedding moved forward seamlessly. Children continued to play, friends and family worked together on small tasks, and the musicians began playing the opening notes for the ceremony. The bride and groom shared quiet smiles, understanding that the day would go on exactly as it should. The presence of the officers had been brief, a minor interruption, but it had served as a subtle reminder of how quickly fear and assumption could enter even the most joyful moments. The neighbor, still at her window, felt a mixture of relief and shame. She had called the authorities, acted out of fear, and now witnessed the simple truth, a joyful celebration, nothing more. She pressed her forehead to the glass, feeling the weight of her assumptions, and tried to reconcile the difference between what she had imagined and what had actually happened. Her hands trembled slightly, and she whispered to herself, a quiet acknowledgement of her error. As the wedding continued, the officers walked back to their vehicle and drove away slowly, waving politely to the couple. The groom waved back, smiling, and returned to his guests. The brief encounter had passed without incident, leaving the wedding intact and joyful. Friends and family resumed their tasks, laughter returning to its natural rhythm, and the music blending perfectly with the sounds of celebration. The bride and groom took a moment for themselves, holding hands and sharing a quiet glance. The tension of the unexpected interruption was gone, replaced by a renewed sense of joy and gratitude. They had handled the situation with patience, understanding, and calm, showing that love and composure could overcome fear and misunderstanding. The neighbor, meanwhile, finally stepped away from the window. She felt a deep sense of embarrassment, a quiet acknowledgement that she had let fear and suspicion guide her actions. Her imagination had created a story far removed from reality, and now she faced the consequences of her assumptions. For the first time, she realized how powerful and misleading unchecked fear could be. Across the yard, the wedding continued uninterrupted. Guests laughed, children played, and friends and family worked together to ensure that every detail was perfect. The groom moved among them, greeting each person, sharing jokes, and offering quiet words of encouragement. The bride adjusted the flowers, smiled at friends, and moved gracefully through the crowd. Every movement reinforced the sense of community, joy, and celebration. The morning had been filled with tension for some, but for the couple and their guests, it had been another step toward a beautiful day. The brief appearance of the officers had been a minor disturbance, quickly resolved by calm, polite interaction. The lesson was quiet but powerful. Fear and assumptions can create tension, but kindness, patience, and clarity can restore harmony. The neighbor, still processing everything, watched for a few more moments before finally closing the blinds. She sat down, her mind full of reflection, realizing that her actions had been driven by suspicion rather than fact. She understood that she had been wrong, and that recognition weighed heavily on her. Yet even in embarrassment, she learned something important about fear, judgment, and perspective. Inside the yard, the couple continued to prepare for the ceremony. Friends and family moved gracefully around them, arranging chairs, checking decorations, and preparing for the arrival of the rest of the guests. Laughter and conversation filled the air, the energy vibrant and light. The music began to swell, signaling that the moment of the ceremony was drawing near. The groom took a deep breath and looked around, taking in the scene. Friends and family were smiling, the children were playing, and the bride's eyes sparkled with excitement. The officer's visit was already becoming a distant memory, overshadowed by the love and celebration surrounding them. He turned to the bride and squeezed her hand gently, a quiet acknowledgement that the day was theirs, and nothing could ruin it. The neighbor sat quietly, reflecting on the morning, the call, and the lessons learned. She realized that sometimes fear could distort reality, that assumptions could lead to unnecessary tension, and that patience and understanding were far more powerful than suspicion. It was a hard lesson, but one that would stay with her long after the music faded and the wedding was over. The wedding had settled into a comfortable rhythm. Guests laughed, children ran across the yard, and friends continued arranging flowers and decorations. The music played softly in the background, and the sun had climbed higher, casting a warm glow over the scene. Everything seemed perfect, yet across the street tension was quietly building. The neighbor had closed her blinds after the officers left, but could not shake the feeling that the situation wasn't over. She kept pacing the room, muttering to herself, wondering how such a large gathering could happen without her knowing every detail in advance. She had convinced herself that there might still be something unusual she had missed, even though the officers had just assured her everything was fine. Her mind raced with questions. What if there were more people than she had counted? What if something unexpected happened later? She tried to calm herself, but the mixture of relief, embarrassment, and lingering fear kept her on edge. Inside the wedding yard, the couple remained unaware of the neighbor's continued anxiety. The groom moved among the guests, smiling and greeting everyone. He checked with the caterers, made sure the musicians were ready, and offered quiet guidance where needed. The bride floated between friends and family, helping with minor details, laughing softly, and sharing moments of excitement with her closest relatives. The day was progressing beautifully, with everyone focused on the celebration. Then, a few minutes later, there was a knock at the neighbor's door. She froze, startled, as if she had been caught in the act of something she shouldn't have done. She opened the door to see two local police officers standing politely on her porch. Their presence immediately made her nervous. She straightened her posture, trying to appear calm, though her hands shook slightly. "Good afternoon," one of the officers said in a professional, even tone. "We just wanted to follow up on the call you made earlier regarding the gathering across the street." The neighbor swallowed nervously. She had been imagining this moment for hours, yet it was different now that it was real. She tried to explain herself, but the words came out faster than she could manage. She spoke of her concern, her fear, and her desire to act responsibly. The officers listened patiently, nodding occasionally. They asked her a few questions about what she had observed, the timing of the events, and the number of people she believed had been present. She described everything in detail, exaggerating unintentionally, her emotions adding weight to her story. The officers wrote notes but maintained a calm, neutral demeanor. They were polite, professional, and careful not to judge. Meanwhile, the wedding continued, full of life and laughter. The groom noticed some activity in the street, realized it involved the neighbor, and reassured the bride that everything would be fine. He greeted the officers warmly when they walked across the yard to introduce themselves properly, explaining that there was no threat and that the gathering was simply a joyful celebration with friends and family. The officers nodded, their expressions showing recognition and understanding. The neighbor, standing just a few feet away, felt her heart race as she observed the interaction. The groom, calm and composed, greeted everyone with warmth. The officers, once wary, were relaxed and polite, clearly seeing that there was no danger at all. The neighbor could feel the embarrassment creeping in. She had expected tension, perhaps even authority intervening firmly, but instead there was calm conversation, smiles, and mutual respect. The bride, noticing the neighbor standing nearby, offered a polite smile. It was a gentle gesture, simple and human, that carried no judgment but acknowledged the presence of someone who had been anxious earlier. The neighbor hesitated, unsure how to respond. She nodded weakly, feeling a mixture of guilt and relief. For the first time, she began to see the day from the perspective of those celebrating rather than her own fears. The officers continued their questions, but their tone was now conversational rather than formal. They asked about the music, the number of guests, and even complimented the decorations. The neighbor, standing slightly behind them, realized how unnecessary her call had been. Her assumptions had created a situation that had never existed. Yet she also recognized that the authorities had handled everything with professionalism and care. Inside the yard, laughter and conversation continued. Guests were oblivious to the neighbor's tension, focused entirely on the joy of the day. Children chased each other around the fountain. A few tripped and laughed as they fell onto the grass. Friends helped set up chairs and tables, sharing jokes and teasing one another. The couple moved among them, their smiles radiant, their joy infectious. Each interaction reinforced the sense of community and love that had brought everyone together. The officers finally turned to the neighbor, offering quiet guidance. "It looks like everything is fine here," one said kindly. "We just wanted to ensure there was no real concern. Sometimes large gatherings can appear alarming from a distance, but it seems this one is peaceful and well managed." The neighbor felt a lump in her throat. She nodded, understanding the message but feeling the weight of her mistake. The groom, sensing the neighbor's discomfort, stepped closer. He spoke in a calm, gentle voice, emphasizing the importance of community and understanding. "We know gatherings can seem overwhelming from the outside," he said. "We appreciate your concern, but today is just a celebration. Everyone is safe, and we want the day to be happy for our family and friends." His words were measured, sincere, and kind. The neighbor felt a wave of emotion. Embarrassment, shame, and a sense of humility all rolled into one. She had acted out, a fear assuming the worst, yet here was a man, calm and patient, explaining the truth without anger or judgment. It was a quiet lesson in grace and understanding, one that she would carry with her long after the wedding was over. Meanwhile, the guests inside the yard continued their activities. The musicians tuned their instruments, the caterers arranged, the food and family members prepared for the upcoming ceremony. The couple moved gracefully through the yard, sharing small moments of laughter and quiet encouragement. Every detail reinforced the love and attention they had put into the day. The neighbor, still standing nearby, finally found her voice. She offered a soft, almost inaudible apology for her earlier assumptions. The groom nodded kindly, accepting it without hesitation. There was no lecture, no anger, just a quiet understanding. The officers smiled politely, acknowledging her gesture, and prepared to leave. Their professionalism and patience had turned what could have been a tense situation into a moment of learning and reflection. The neighbor closed the door slowly, leaning against it as she processed the events. She realized how powerful assumptions and fear could be, how quickly they could escalate into unnecessary action. Her imagination had transformed a simple celebration into a story of danger, yet reality had proven otherwise. It was a humbling experience, one that would change how she viewed her neighbors and her own fears in the future. Inside the yard, the wedding moved forward without interruption. The ceremony was about to begin, and guests were guided into their seats. The groom stood near the entrance, ready to greet the bride as she arrived. Children were gently seated by family members, and friends helped with last-minute adjustments. Music played softly, and the air was filled with the scent of fresh flowers and the warmth of the sun. The neighbor from her house could see the wedding continuing. She felt a strange mix of relief and reflection. She had learned a lesson in humility, understanding, and the dangers of assuming the worst. Her fear had been real to her, but the reality of the joyful celebration reminded her of the importance of perspective. She realized that sometimes patience, observation, and trust were more powerful than suspicion. The couple shared a quiet glance, their hands brushing as they moved through the yard. They exchanged a small smile, acknowledging the morning's unexpected tension but also embracing the day ahead. The moment reinforced their connection, the love they shared, and the joy of being surrounded by family and friends. Their calm presence had diffused the situation entirely, proving that patience and kindness could overcome fear and misunderstanding. Guests took their seats, children sat quietly with their families, and the musicians began the opening notes for the ceremony. The day had been full of unexpected events, but nothing could overshadow the love and happiness that filled the yard. Friends and family continued to share smiles and laughter, unaware of the neighbors' earlier tension, except for the few who had noticed the officers and realized the brief interruption had passed. The neighbor, finally seated in her own home, reflected on the events of the morning. She realized that fear could cloud judgment, and assumptions could create unnecessary conflict. Yet she also recognized the power of calm, professionalism, and understanding to transform potentially tense situations into lessons of grace and empathy. She knew she would carry this experience with her, a quiet reminder of the importance of seeing situations clearly before reacting. Back in the wedding yard, the ceremony began. Music filled the air, guests watched attentively, and the couple prepared for one of the most important moments of their lives. The sun shone brightly, casting a warm golden glow over everyone present. Laughter, love, and joy surrounded the yard, a perfect reflection of the couple's relationship and the community that supported them. The neighbor, looking out her window, one last time, allowed herself a small, almost imperceptible smile. She had learned an important lesson about fear, assumptions, and the strength of human kindness. The wedding continued, full of life and happiness, while she quietly acknowledged her own growth and reflection. The day was far from over, but one thing was certain. The brief moment of tension had passed, leaving behind a story of understanding, patience, and the quiet power of human connection. The couple, their guests, and even the neighbor had been touched in some way, each learning a lesson about fear, grace, and the importance of perspective. The afternoon sun bathed the wedding yard in a warm, golden glow. After the brief interruption, caused by the neighbor's call and the officer's visit, the celebration continued with renewed energy. Guests were fully immersed in the joy of the day, laughter echoing across the lawn and children playing in the soft grass. The groom moved calmly among the tables, checking on food, flowers, and guests, while the bride floated gracefully from group to group, her smile radiant, carrying a quiet glow that seemed to lift everyone around her. The neighbor, who had spent the morning filled with worry and suspicion, sat quietly in her own home, reflecting on everything that had happened. She replayed the events in her mind, the call she had made, the arrival of the officers, the calm and polite handling of the situation by the groom and the authorities. A mix of emotions churned inside her: embarrassment, humility, and a sense of realization that fear and assumptions had nearly robbed her of seeing the truth. She understood now that the happiness she had tried to disrupt in her mind was real, peaceful, and filled with love. Back in the yard, the guests were preparing for the ceremony. Chairs had been neatly arranged, the musicians had tuned their instruments, and the air was filled with anticipation. The bride and groom exchanged quiet smiles, squeezing each other's hands as they shared a private moment of excitement. Everything they had worked for, every detail, every effort, was coming together perfectly. Their families and friends were there to witness it, and the energy of love and community enveloped the yard. The neighbor, finally stepping away from her window, decided to take a walk. She stepped outside into the warm sunlight, letting her eyes wander toward the wedding across the street. She saw the couple, the guests, and the decorations, and for the first time, she truly saw them without the filter of fear. The scene that had caused her so much anxiety now looked vibrant, joyful, and harmless. She felt a quiet wave of humility, realizing how quickly imagination and suspicion could warp perception. Inside the yard, the ceremony began. Guests were seated, smiling faces turned toward the entrance, and soft music played as the bride walked slowly down the aisle. The groom's eyes were fixed on her, full of love and admiration. Their families watched closely, some dabbing tears from their eyes, others holding hands tightly with loved ones. The entire atmosphere was filled with emotion, and for a brief moment the past tension was entirely forgotten, replaced by the beauty of love, unity, and human connection. The neighbor watched from her porch, her hands folded in front of her. She felt small in comparison to the scene of happiness and community before her. She understood now that her actions, though well-intentioned, had been unnecessary. Her fear had driven her to imagine danger where none existed, and yet she had witnessed the power of calm, patience, and understanding in resolving the situation. She felt a quiet gratitude for the lessons learned, even if they came wrapped in embarrassment. As the ceremony continued, the couple exchanged vows, their voices steady, warm, and filled with sincerity. Guests leaned forward to hear every word, captivated by the emotion and intimacy of the moment. The sun cast long, soft shadows, and the gentle breeze carried the scent of flowers across the yard. It was a scene of human connection at its finest, a reminder of why people gather, celebrate, and support one another. The neighbor, standing silently across the street, felt a strange sense of connection. Though she had not been a part of the celebration, she could see the genuine love, joy, and community spirit that surrounded the couple. For the first time that day, she felt peace rather than suspicion. She understood that sometimes, stepping back, observing, and trusting others could prevent unnecessary stress and misunderstanding. After the vows, the couple shared their first kiss, and a wave of applause and cheers swept through the yard. Friends and family clapped, some laughing with joy, others wiping tears from their eyes. Children ran toward the couple, hugging them, while the musicians began to play a more upbeat tune, signaling the start of the celebration that everyone had been waiting for. The atmosphere was electric with happiness, and every worry, tension, or fear from earlier in the day felt distant and insignificant. The neighbor, moved by the scene, slowly walked back to her front door. She realized that her actions had been driven by fear and assumptions, yet she had also witnessed a community's capacity for patience, understanding, and grace. She took a deep breath, feeling a quiet determination to approach her neighbors with more trust in the future. She understood that the day had been a reminder of the power of perspective and empathy. Inside the wedding yard, the reception began. Guests moved freely, chatting, laughing, and enjoying the food. The musicians played